Good morning from the office of the Newberry Church of Christ. I'm Jess Carter. I'd like to talk to you this morning about a subject of studying God's Word. In 2 Timothy 2 and 15, the Old King James Version says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." When we study the Bible, a lot of us, we do not have an understanding of what this book is all about. We look at the Bible, and sometimes some think of this book as being one book, but it's really not. Some will say that this is two books, that is the Old Testament and the New Testament, but really that is not the case. This book is a book that is made up of 66 books, 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. We look at this, we have to realize that the Bible, as we have it, is not in the order that it was written. I wish sometimes that people would realize that, and I think it would be easier for us to understand if we looked at the Bible in the order that it was written and think about that. For instance, we look at the 27 books of the New Testament. A lot of times people think that Matthew was the first book written, and it was not, far from being the first book written. When we look at the books, we can see that when the church was established in that day of Pentecost, there just after the death of Christ in about 30 or 31 AD, that what happened next was that so many of the Jews in Jerusalem obeyed the gospel. When they obeyed the gospel, they stayed there, but then because of persecution, they were scattered abroad. When they were scattered abroad, they needed some kind of encouragement. The apostles and the rest stayed there, the leaders, but they went out. Well, what happened was in their generation, just in the probably around 44 or around in the early 40s, all of a sudden James wrote a book. He wrote a book to those people that were scattered abroad. And that is what is the first book, I notice, the first book written of the New Testament. And that was the book of James, a book of simple facts for those Jewish Christians that they should follow. Now, it wasn't shortly after that we realized that Cornelius and others was baptized. The Gentile world was reached. When they was reached, the Jewish Christians, they had a little bit of trouble accepting those people that was not of the covenant of Abraham. And so we have the second book came into being need, was the book of Galatians. The book of Galatians was written to show that both Jew and Gentile could come in and be part of the kingdom or the church of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So that book was written probably in the later 40s. Some have put the date of 48. I would not disagree with that. That would be probably pretty close to that time that Galatians was written, between 48 and 50 at least. And then we can see the church existing as two different religious backgrounds of people. And 1 Thessalonians was probably the next book written in about 50, followed by 2 Thessalonians, written in 50 and 51. And then we find 1 Corinthians was written in probably 55 or 56. We look at this and we can realize that this was towards the end of the first generation. If we count a generation, and always, a generation is usually 20 years. Someone that is within 20 years of us, we can say we are in their generation. So there was people, most of the people then were beginning to die that had known Jesus or had been fresh in their minds. Basically, there was a people alive and said, well, that was in the old days. And so there was another book needed to be written. And that is, a book was written, and that book was Mark. The first of the gospel was written. Mark was probably written, the earliest, probably about 55. I would say most people think in the late 50s or around 60, the book of Mark was written, and it was telling the story of Jesus, the Savior. And then The next book that was written, probably was written just shortly almost after that, a year or so, was the book of 2 Corinthians. The 2 Corinthians was written to really talk to the church. And then in 56 and 57, the Roman letter was written. The Roman letter was written, and it was written to tell the Romans that they was basically the faith and what it was to be a Christian. I love Romans chapter 6, where it talks about how a person is basically baptized into Christ. And then after that, we can see in 60, some generation and a half after Christ, that Luke saw that there was a need to give basically a very accurate account. Being a physician, he wrote down and gave a very accurate account for those people that wanted to know about Jesus. And because most of the people that had seen Jesus was dead or dying at that age. These was the average age of the Roman world was about 43. Some 30 years after Christ, many of the people was gone that had knew and heard him. And then that was written Luke in 60. Then Ephesians was written in probably 60, Colossians, Philemons, and then even Matthew, Philippians was all written during the time of the 60s. Even after Philippians, there in about 62, 1 Timothy, Titus in 62. And then came Acts, just there in the late 60s, Acts. Wrote down a history because there was people, I could see both Jews and Gentiles wanting to know, now how did this movement start? They saw the result of the church. The church was being spread all through the Roman Empire and beyond. How did this all start? And so that book was written to give them a detail of what had happened those early years with the apostles, and gave a story of how the Jews was reached on that day of Pentecost, how the Romans, how the outsiders, the Gentiles was reached in chapter 10, and then how Paul reached not only out to Jew and Gentile, but to the whole world in his missionary journey. And then towards the end, we can see that 1 Peter was written in 64, Jude in 64 or 65, 2 Peter 64 or 65, Timothy probably in 66 or 67, and Hebrew in the late 60s sometime. These books was written. And then we can see that after that, towards the end of the first century, John wrote his books. 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John in the 80s. And then John, the last of the books of the gospel, written probably late 80s or around 90. And then he ended in Revelation, probably from 90 or 95. These books was written not to a split church, because the church had been there long enough now. It had been there 2 generations, or over 2 generations. And so everybody did not look at themselves as being Gentile or Jew, but they looked at themselves as being just Christians, that family, and the relationship we need to have. That's the book that I love to read about where we are to love. Love one another, remember him. And then in Revelation, remember that he is coming back for us. God be with you. Amen.